Just because Dana called it out, so now I'm curious, how many of you guys like actually feel comfortable, familiar with accessibility, ADA compliance? Just like show of hands. Okay, that's not bad. All right, do you guys know of those who raised their hand, do you know what iteration of the WCAG we are currently on? What is it? 2.1, thank you, you're my favorite. Okay, so I want to talk about practical design for accessibility. It is something that's been coming out more recently, the past 3 years. So the past couple jobs I've had, everyone says like, yeah, you know, we create accessible products or services, and then I actually get into the design of it, and I find that they either don't actually know or don't actually care. So let's see. So what we're going to talk about real quick, so I'm just going to give an overview of what accessibility is, what that means for the digital age. Back up a second. We're going to talk about the laws and standards. You know, is accessibility enforceable? Yes. Talk about the WCAG because that's kind of the core component of accessibility, so we'll talk about what that even means, and then how to actually implement it. And so I'm going to be dropping a lot of stuff at you. I don't really have any like memes or Staples jokes, but I do have like a ton of links, like so many links. So if you guys go to this GitHub repo, and you're going to see this link again, so you know if you're like writing it down, don't worry too much. Basically, every single resource or tool that I mention is listed on there. So first of all, just to recap, so we're all on the same page, what is accessibility? Basically, it means that a digital product is usable by everyone. So the W3C, if you're not familiar, the World Wide Web Consortium, they are the organization that drive web accessibility standards. So what is accessibility really? Visually, it means that things must be placed and styled in a way that makes sense and that are perceivable to the user. They have to be able to logically understand what they're seeing. They have to be able to see it. And programmatically, things must be used logically and in a way that can be analyzed by assistive technology. So assistive technology, that can be anything from using a screen reader, a sip and puff wands. So people that don't have the use of their hands, they have this wand that they can control with the air intake of their mouth, or even just using your keyboard only. That counts as assistive tech. So why should you care? Accessible design is a best practice. You know, when you have something that's more accessible, it's just more usable for everyone. It's a better usability best practice. But you also help people that may be set back in other ways. Maybe they're not disabled, but they could have a slower internet connection. Maybe they're in the middle of a chaotic environment. They're on their phone in the middle of a hospital, or they're not a native English speaker. Furthermore, a lot of material nowadays are only digital only, so things like training manuals or videos. There is no print copy of that, so if you don't have an accessible product, you're alienating someone who has no other alternative. So the laws and standards, so this is kind of a difficult part, but we do have to get through it. There's basically a lot of players that are involved. Basically, there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. There is the Section 508 regulations, which are upheld by the Department of Justice. And there's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. So I've heard people say WCAG or just WCAG. I prefer WCAG, but they all refer to the same thing. So I'm just going to be mentioning what they're about and how they all interact. So the ADA, obviously you're probably familiar with them. They require things like having accessible buildings like wheelchair ramps or elevators, but they also pertain to electronic communications as well. So one thing that's super important to note is that certain businesses have to comply, and anything that has US, state, or local government agencies, by law, need to be accessible. So now you're wondering, okay, cool, the law tells me I have to be accessible. What does that mean? The ADA doesn't really have standards. They have a toolkit, the link to which is in the GitHub repo, but it's kind of very general. However, despite that, we still did manage to see many lawsuits because of ADA. So one famous case is the NAD, National Association of the Deaf versus Netflix. They set the legal standard for being able to sue for having a non-compliant service or website. And there's been many others since, Hulu, Blue Apron, things like that. And they argued on the case that they don't have a place of public accommodation because they're digital service, which to me is like, that's even worse. Like, you only have one method of accessing your content, and some people just can't even access it at all. And they're saying that therefore they're exempt from the ADA. So legally, not true. So Section 508, this is a regulation that pertains to any federal institution or US government website or application, or anything that receives federal funds. So this means a bank that's FDIC insured, or a hospital or a school that receives grants. It also means any program used by US federal agencies. So it doesn't even have to be by them, it just has to be used by them. And guidelines do exist for them. They're also slightly general. I'll go back a slide. So the guidelines are a little more helpful than the ADA. However, they're still kind of up in the air. And the reason I mention that is because now we come to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So these establish very clear and precise standards for what accessibility is, and how you go about implementing that on your product or service. So when I say for the web, similar guidelines exist for user agents, so that's things like browsers, or also for authoring tools, so content management systems. They're different technical standards, but they all have the same general idea. So the important question here is, who needs to comply? So, well, technically the WCAG are voluntary standards, but the catch here is that they are referred to by the Department of Justice regarding Section 508 as being more current and thorough than 508 themselves. So you do not have, so the WCAG has no authority on their own, but they are referred to, and therefore people that have to comply with ADA or Section 508 should also conform with WCAG standards. That's the main takeaway from that. So it's not only good UX, but it's enforceable. A lot of people think that, they can kind of ignore it. It's not really their problem, but, a lawsuit can show up at your door. So I'm not going to go into every little detail of the WCAG. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through it line by line, but I do want to introduce it because it does have a lot of important components that, like I've mentioned, where I work, people say they know it. They nod and say, yes, I know my product is accessible. But then they just don't understand the actual mandatory guidelines that you have to achieve. So it's built on certain levels. They're all backwards compatible, right? So to be level AA compliant, you also have to meet the level below it because it works on a pyramid scheme, basically, of growing accessibility. So each level is a certain level of accessibility, starting with where we maintain the most basic accessibility features. That's where things like having color contrast comes into play. Level AA is the standard that most software or product try to achieve. That's the one where they actually meet and exceed Section 508 standards, is WCAG 2.0. And level AAA, this one is trying to be as accessible as humanly possible. However, the WCAG does kind of allow that it's really hard to achieve this, so it's something that you should strive for it. You may not get there, but at least in striving for it, you would surpass level AA. So if you haven't seen it before, this is the WCAG. It's kind of a lengthy document. If you haven't read through it on your own, it's kind of torturous, so I'm not going to shame you into doing that, but you really should be comfortable with it. So basically they kind of list out all the different principles that they have, ways that you can achieve it, success criteria, things like that. And then I really want to talk about 2.1 because these came out 2 weeks ago, June 5th. So previously we were all operating under 2.0, so all of the scanning tools, all of the references, all of the manuals, they're all referring to WCAG 2.0, and we're now on 2.1. So we have a couple new guidelines. This is not all of them, all right? So if this concerns you in any way and you're in any shape or form related to the development, design, whatever, of software of a site, you need to know what those new principles are. And because the WCAG itself is kind of torture to go through, they do have a quick reference available, and that's the one we see on the left. It has things like filtering, and it includes like links to understanding further documentation. And I actually spoke with someone who wrote, who's on the W3 scene, who wrote the documentation, and they're aware of the fact that it's kind of hard to go through sometimes, but that's due to like necessary technical clarity, right? When you're writing a document, you want to be precise. So to combat that, there is a version, this is a third party, that is written in layman's English. So it's a lot more easy to understand, and I recommend that version because it's a better starting point. So let's say that this is new to you, or you need to explain it to someone, or you have to submit it as a resource to someone who's completely new to it. The one on the right is better to start with because it does make things a lot simpler to understand. It doesn't use technical jargon. However, another caveat, because this was written with 2.0 in mind, it does not include any 2.1 standards, which is why I'm like gonna be saying this a lot, but if this is pertinent to you, you need to know what 2.1 consists of, and you need to manually assess for that. So now, kind of the fun part, I guess, implementation. Now that we know what we're trying to achieve, how do we achieve it? So you should start with accessibility first, right? You can't like backtrack and try to squeeze it into a finished product. That always ends super terribly. I'm sure many of us have seen it. You need to start with accessibility in mind first. So, I'm a UI, UX designer. There's a lot of times when I'll struggle for like so long on just not being able to get the right color combination on something, or I need to go back and like edit, this CTA is the wrong shade of blue or whatever. But it means it has very real consequences for the whole UI, because if I shift this, then this also has to change, and that has to change. So it's this whole waterfall effect of just terribleness. So you need to start with accessibility in mind first, rather than backtracking. And I won't lie, like it's very difficult sometimes when you're working with color and aesthetics and you're like, well, the only color contrast compliant thing, and I'll get into that passes, looks like mud. I have this dark orange on white and that looks terrible. And that is difficult, admittedly, but design is not for you. Design is for the user. You want to make sure that people can perceive what they're actually looking at, especially because as a UI designer, they're working with process and methods. They're there to perform a function. And if they can't see your console, your UI, what is even the point? Sorry, I feel like I'm yelling at you guys. Sorry. I get like really passionate. All right. So tips for UX. This is obvious, right? But test with disabled users. So how do we make that realistic? So you need to be able, so try to recruit disabled users. I haven't checked each and every single testing tool out there, but for example, I looked at Optimal Workshop recently, and they said they're working on adding disabled users as part of the user pool, so okay, cool. I don't know what other ones do, but definitely check it out, whatever your designated testing tool is. So if you can't do that, hire consultants or advocates, or there are third-party testers such as Access Labs is one of them, and the link to that is in the repo. And then last and honestly least, you can do simulations. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with age kits. They're kind of more for empathy testing. Basically, it's kind of this package where there's gloves, these huge like rubber coated gloves, and there's glasses that simulate color blindness, and you have to open like a pill bottle. And it's meant to make you more empathetic towards the challenges that maybe the elderly go through as they're trying to do like everyday functions that some of us don't have a problem with. So some people will kind of use those as their disability testing. However, the reason they're not like recommended is because they don't really open up the full scope of a disability. They're a false positive. So people will think like, oh, I've got these glasses on, but I can still see this. And then they think they understand the disability. They think that they have the solution when that's just not the case. So include diverse personas. These are the impairments that are like officially listed by the WCAG. So when you're creating your persona, try to include one of these: the impairment, the level of impairment, how detrimental is their disability to the function they're trying to perform, and then how do they access your site or service. So one example is if they have Parkinson's, for example, so they have hand tremors. This can have like a very real design consequence in a positive sense, because maybe you end up with bigger buttons. So because of that, now you have a more accessible design, and everyone wins, because like who doesn't benefit from being able to see call to actions? So be predictable. You know, the Persona 5 UI would be cool to see on stuff, but it just doesn't really, it's not super friendly to someone who has maybe a cognitive impairment. So for example, this is an ad I got, and those monsters put the close button on the very left, and I actually had to take a moment to look for it. So just because you're trying to entrap users, or rather I should say don't try to entrap users, right? Just to increase your conversions, it doesn't work out. If you stick with patterns that are already established and someone knows, kind of has a general idea of where to get going, you eliminate a lot of the guesswork. Use unique titles. So this one's a little weird. It could also mean kind of use plain language. So this has a this is a practical requirement for the WCAG, where they say that, you know, you can't have repetitive links that have the same text but go to different places. So one way that you could use that is remove them altogether if you can. So try to, instead of having more details, and 7 different read more buttons, you know, if you're making a site, you can just make the title a link instead. This is less applicable for software, but it's the same kind of general idea. Try to remove the redundancy in your wording. And if you're using conversational design, if you guys are familiar with that, it's where you use more plainer conversational language, like, you know, help me get you started. Let's work on this issue. What are you trying to achieve? If you use that kind of language in your design, that will help remove some of these as well. I'm skipping over some of the development side of it, mostly because I don't want to go over on time, but I did include links to things like that in the GitHub repo if you're interested, if you see that on the slide. So allow feedback. This one's kind of also obvious, but I feel like not enough people do it, is just let people tell you how they can help, how you can be better. A lot of apps or software do have somewhere in the user settings, like for example, I found this on Amazon, do you have suggestions for the app? And it's that simple. You know, obviously this is post-testing. You should be doing everything you can prior to releasing a product. But, you know, what's wrong with gathering more feedback and iterating and improving? You can also do this for with websites. This is what I found on the gov.uk footer. They simply had after, well, they didn't. You should probably include like a CAPTCHA or something, an accessible one, so that you don't get a ton of spam, but let people just fill out a form about what they would like to see. Tips that are more UI focused. So this one, where do I start with this? So you should design mobile first, and it's not maybe for the reason you think. When you design for mobile experiences, you're automatically creating a more accessible experience. You already have a limited screen size. You're already considering a reduced limitations to the interactivity. You know, you no longer have a hover. You no longer have a scroll. Now you can only tap. There's pointer down and pointer up. Those are really your only 2 options. And you also have environmental distractions. So let's not like pretend that we don't look at our phone when we drive. Or if you're in a hospital, you know, you're looking quickly through your information. You're talking to a doctor. You're in the ER. You're on Google Maps trying to find something before you're like me, trying to figure out how to get to this building before it starts. So you're already considering all of those things when you're designing mobile first. And this is especially important because one of the new principles in 2.1 is that it is now not compliant to have text that scrolls in more than one direction. So if you have a screen size, so 320 pixels is the typical mobile size, right? If you have something like that, then if that is your width, then you cannot scroll past that width. So what that means is that a lot of tabular data that overflows, so I've seen a lot of websites when they shrink to mobile, they just have a very hard time reformatting tables. So you would probably have to reformat entirely into a card structure. And the contrast on this is like super great, but you can kind of see that there's like a lineation here. So kind of taking all of your content and moving it into the card format Like when Chris is talking about using cards for dashboards, that is excellent because they lend themselves very well to stacking vertically. So use an accessible design system. There's a lot of free ones out there, actually. So the US itself has a design system that's available for free. It claims to already be Section 508 compliant, so that's half your work for you. Google's material design as well claims to be accessible. You can also find many more at adele.uxpin.com. It's just this really cool site where they actually list them all out. If you're working with an internal system yourself, this is where you're going to just have to know the principles and make sure that you're catching all of that in your UI library or design system. So make sure you have things like hover states, interactivity, clear error messaging. And be wary of themes or templates. So like if you've ever worked with a WordPress theme or things like that, I actually had, not too long ago, we were working with a WordPress theme and they turned off focus indicators on 3 separate style sheets. Like they really did not want you to know where you were at all. So be wary of things just because it comes out of the box. In fact, that's probably worse. So especially with the current design trends of making things like one half a shade darker than its background, it can be really hard to see what you're looking at. And especially because WordPress themes tend to be, you know, like very cutting edge design, that's a very common trap to fall into. So use appropriate color contrast and sizing. This one I feel like is pretty well known, right? We've definitely come across this one, but it's important. So basically, it means that you have to have a certain color contrast ratio depending on the size of your text and UI. There's a lot of different like contrast checkers out there. Honestly, I think the only one that you should be trusting is this one right here by WebAIM themselves, because they're not going to give you predefined color squares and tell you this one passes on this one. You can just drop in your own colors and see for yourself, and it will actually explain to you what you need to be achieving and why. A little design trick, you can use drop shadows or outlines if needed, so things like borders, that does work. And then if this is a software or app of some sort, this should be in addition to already compliant color contrast and sizing, but include text size settings or color adjustments so people can do it on their own. So it's kind of hard to see, but that screenshot is from the video game Monster Hunter World. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it had like numerous UI issues. This is probably actually a completely different conversation about Japanese video game UI design, but they have very narrow text. Just culturally, they prefer to have more information up front, all the data they would need. And when they translated this directly for Western audiences were completely overwhelmed. Text was super hard to read. Even after multiple, they did update the text. People are still having a lot of issues looking through the menus and understanding what they're doing. And that's just a video game. So imagine if this was necessary software or a dashboard with critical messaging. So this is another one that's new in 2.1, and I mentioned color contrast specifically because now it applies to UI as well, so it's not just text. So for example, this is a calendar that I have to use for school, and like it's really washed out on the screen, but honestly, like it's kind of realistic. I don't really know where I have to go if I want to, like what does that plus button do? Is it just text? Is it a button? You need to make sure that any element that represents an interactive function has an appropriate amount of color contrast. And there are exceptions, as you can see, so if things are disabled, they don't need to have that sufficient contrast ratio. Integrations where you have no power over it, so third-party content, and graphics where, of course, like if you were to change the colors, then it would just invalidate the graphic. So the squint test, this is more of a designy one, but so if you squint right now, like what stands out to you in this design? Do you know what in the menu you're looking out for? So this is a really cool test that you can do to help your primary elements stand out. So if you're wondering, you know, does having this call to action up here and down here help? What are you trying to do? Questions that you can ask yourself are, do the primary elements stand out? Like I said, are things sufficiently distinguished? Can you see the main thing that you're supposed to see? Do differently actionable items blur together? So for example, that menu, if I squint, they all look the same. Is that something I want? and do things that function differently look the same. So there's also a Chrome extension literally called the squint test that you can just download, and it will just blur your screen for you if you don't feel like, I don't know, closing your eyes. And then this one, I swear Chris stole these from me because we did not talk about this beforehand. But yes, there are a lot of plugins or other resources you can use directly in your design programs. So I personally do use Sketch and Photoshop. They do have that color blindness proof. Stark for Sketch is great. There's also other ones like Color Contrast Analyzer. That one you can just select your layers in Sketch, go to the plugin, and it'll tell you pass, you fail. Easy enough. And tips for development. So you can test your own work. Like if you have any sort of capability to try out what you create, there's not really an excuse for just testing things out yourself. So you might not have like a sip and puff wand, but you might have a keyboard. So you can just test to see if you can tab through what it is that you're supposed to be tabbing through, and can you see it? And from there, can you perform the action you need? So for example, I was working on a site where someone actually had to call in and say, I use a screen reader and I can't even log in, because once they got to that drop down, they were stuck on a loop and couldn't actually go down the list of items. If someone had bothered to just tab through their own work, we wouldn't have had to have that call. So there's a lot of screen readers for free, but there's native ones to certain OSs. So Macs have VoiceOver, Windows has JAWS or NV Access, Linux has Orca. You can find more. There's also extensions or add-ons for whatever browser you're using. Alt tags, I kind of want to gloss over this one, honestly, because it's really self-explanatory, and I feel like we all kind of get it. Just the main takeaway from here is that people don't really know how to write alt tags. So in text, in front-end development, you actually have to say, this is class image, it has a title, and you just need to fill out what the image represents. Basically what you'd be missing if the image was not there. It's only for images that actually have a purpose. So if this is like a decorational image, if this is like a CSS background image, you don't need alt text for that. And I mentioned that everything on the web has to be compliant, so that includes PDFs. Compliant PDFs have their own standards, and they need to have things like, they should be in the correct format, UA, Universal Accessible Format. They need to be tagged, and what that means is basically alt text for PDFs. So if you know what a PDF is, you know that it can be either a static image or it can be actually editable text, but really does a screen reader know what that is? So you can go in and kind of tag each part of the PDF and tell it programmatically what is going on in that square. If you create any sort of software that exports to PDFs, your resulting PDF needs to be compliant as well. But thankfully, there are checkers out there where you can just scan your PDF and it'll tell you, what's wrong with it and how to fix it. Those resources are available in the repo as well. And finally, scanning tools. So there's a lot to know, I won't lie. The WCAG itself is a really intimidating document. Even with a lot of, I've read through them probably 3 years, and I'm still like finding out different like little things I didn't quite know in certain use cases and different tips and things like that. So scanning tools help. If you're new to accessibility, the ADA, WCAG, I recommend you start with a scanning tool, but I do want to really warn you that there's no alternative for just manually assessing on your own. Scanning tools are great at telling you if, you're missing alt text on this image, but they're not going to know on an image if your text is compliant or not with enough contrast. So that's why no matter what you do need to go in and validate what the tool you're using is telling you. Also, again, these were all built for 2.0. Not a single one incorporates 2.1 yet. So until the day that comes out, you're going to have to be familiar with those 2.1 principles and evaluate for them on your own. So the ones I recommend, SiteImprove, so they have an actual, like a full tool, and basically it's a subscription based, and you can just plug in your site and it'll generate a whole report and everything like that. It'll tell you page by page, like you have these errors on here. It's really cool. If you don't want to pay for it, there's a free extension on Chrome. It works fine. I use it personally. It's my first go-to. You just have to go page by page and reload the extension, but it's not a big deal. Lighthouse, that's an auditing tool through Google. If you go to the inspector tools, you can just go in and it's their accessibility tab. Wave, that's just code validator. HTML code sniffer, it's also a code validator. These are all good places to start, and then like I said, you want to fill in the gaps on your own. So that was kind of a huge info dump, and I'm sorry for that. So some final notes that didn't really fit in anywhere. Web content has to be accessible. We went over that. User agents, browsers, CMSs, anything on the web needs to be accessible. You need to have users be able to perceive them, logically understand them, no matter what their impairment. If you're in doubt, if you're not sure, design accessibly. Like I said, more accessible user experience is just a better user experience overall. Compliance is a moving target. So we just recently got the 2.1 guidelines. So there's a lot of people that are still under the impression that we're under 2.0, or they're saying, you know, I was compliant before my editor went in and added a whole new blog post that has like fuchsia text or it has like neon green in it. So now you're not compliant anymore. So just because you achieve compliance in one section of the site or on one date does not mean that you're going to be compliant moving forward. It's a very active process. You need to constantly be assessing for that. And finally, there's no official certification, sorry. There are like random services that do claim to certify you. Honestly, I think they're bogus. Like you or I could make our own company and tomorrow claim to certify people. There's absolutely no way to validate that. So if it makes other people feel better and like they want more trust in you, you can say that you're certified through whatever. But none of them are endorsed through the WCAG or W3C or anything like that. So tread wisely. And again, that's the link where you'll find the whole list of resources that I may have specifically mentioned or just implied. There's a whole lot in there, such as the different cases, the different PDF scanners, all sorts of good stuff. And that's it. Thank you.